Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to give folks another minute to join, and then we'll get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's CCJ web event on violent crime trends. I'm Charlotte Bailey, Policy and Program Associate here at the Council on Criminal Justice. If this is your first council event, welcome. The Council is an independent, nonpartisan think tank and invitational membership organization. Through our membership, our analyses, our task forces, and events, the Council works to serve as a center of gravity for the criminal justice field. Over the last year, organizations, the field, and our nation have been immersed in a discussion about rising levels of violence in our communities. In response to this challenge, the Council launched the Violent Crime Working Group to address the most critical and challenging issues related to the drivers of violent crime and highlight effective solutions for policymakers. Today's discussion will feature 4 experts from the field who will share what we are seeing, both in the research and on the ground in our communities. Before we begin our program, a few notes. We are joined by nearly 500 participants, including policymakers, the public, and the media. To ensure a quality experience for everyone, all lines are muted. But we want to hear from you. Throughout today's session, you can submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will take as many questions as possible at the end of today's session. Now, let's welcome CCJ Senior Fellow and Chair of the Violent Crime Working Group, Thomas Abt. Thomas is the author of Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. Prior to the Council, he served as a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy and Law Schools, and before that, he held leadership positions in the New York Governor's Office and the Department of Justice. Thomas's work has been featured in major media outlets, and his TED Talk on saving lives by stopping violence has been viewed more than 190,000 times. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Charlotte, and welcome everyone on the webinar today. As you heard, we're here today to discuss recent crime trends and what to do about them. In terms of trends, we're fortunate to have Rick Rosenfeld with us to present findings from last week's report that he authored along with CCJ's Ernesto Lopez, as well as some new information concerning arrest rates and police activity. Rick is a distinguished professor emeritus of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Missouri-St. Louis. And he's also a fellow and past president of the American Society of Criminology, and for many years has been a leading authority on crime trends and crime control policy. Rick is joined by Jeff Asher, a nationally recognized data analyst whose work has been published by the New York Times, Vox, and 538, among others. He is the co-founder of AH Analytics, which publishes an important series of public dashboards that aggregate data related to criminal justice and also COVID-19. We also have 2 members of the Council's recently formed Violent Crime Working Group with us today. Eddie Bocanegra is a violence prevention pioneer who currently leads READI Chicago, an initiative that provides employment combined with cognitive behavioral therapy, skill building, and other support for those at the highest risk of becoming involved in gun violence. Previously, Eddie served as director of the YMCA of Chicago and also as the violence interrupter for Chicago's ceasefire program, where he was featured in the award-winning documentary, The Interrupters. Emada Tingirides is a deputy chief with the Los Angeles Police Department, where she has served since 1992. Emada leads the Community Safety Partnership Program, a relation-based approach to policing that helps residents advocate for themselves and thrive without the fear of crime in their community. In 2015, she was named the Public Official of the Year by Governing Magazine and one of Los Angeles' most influential women by Los Angeles Magazine. Now, the Violent Crime Working Group was launched just last week in response to the rising rates of violent crime that we're discussing today. Its 16 members include police officers, community leaders, and academics. Some have backgrounds in criminology, while others are trained in public health. Many group members have faced violent crime firsthand, with lived experiences that inform their work today. Regardless of who they are or where they come from, all members are dedicated to the group's mission, which is to save lives by improving policy and practice concerning violent crime. Over the coming months, the group will produce a steady stream of bulletins updating the public on its progress and providing recommendations for policy and practice. In addition, the group will hold public briefings like the one we're having today. Lastly, before we jump in, I'd like to thank the Charles Koch Institute, Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and Microsoft for their support of this important work. Now let's get started. Rick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. And let me share screen. Okay, I have, first of all, can everyone see the screen?
Not yet, Rick.
Sorry about that. I apologize. I'm going to try this one more time.
Take your time.
Okay.
We can see the screen.
You can see the slides?
Yes, I think you just need to maximize and put it into presentation mode. Perfect.
All right. So I'm going to talk about what's happened to crime and what's happened in a few cities to police activity as measured by arrests and citations since the beginning of the pandemic. So we'll be looking back over about the last year and a half. I'm going to address three research questions. One is what did happen to crime rates during the pandemic? The second is what happened to police activity during the pandemic. And the third is, and this one is a very preliminary take at, did declines in police activity lead to increases in violence, which has been the subject of quite a bit of debate about crime increases in recent months. Let's first look at crime trends. The basic story is that through June of this year, compared to January to June of last year, the basic story is violent crimes are up, other crimes are down. For example, during the first half of 2021, in the 22 cities for which we had homicide rates, we're seeing homicide rates remaining above the levels during the same period in prior years. The number of homicides rose 16% compared to the first half of 2020. And in those 22 cities, that's a net addition of 259 more homicides. And homicides rose by 42% from the first half of 2019, another 548 homicides. The rate of increase, however, in homicide has slowed somewhat from the first to the second quarter of this year. In the first quarter of this year through March, homicides were up 23% compared to the same period last year. In the second quarter, April through June, homicides were up 10% compared to the same period last year. There is some indication then of a slowing in the rate of increase in homicide. Non-fatal assaults, including gun assaults, also rose, but not at the level of the increases we've seen in homicide. Other crimes, including robbery, burglary, larcenies, and drug offenses, have continued to decline through the first half of this year. Here's an example of what we're seeing in the case of homicide. So what we've got here are weekly homicide rates in 22 cities. And these are the rates per 100,000 city population from January of 2018 through June of this year. And as you can see, there is a rough cyclical pattern to the change in homicide over time. I've noted the prior seasonal peak back in June of 18, and then we see that big jump beginning in late May and in June across those 22 cities in homicide. We see some decline in the fall and winter, and then another rise this spring. And as I mentioned, we remain above that prior seasonal peak. Homicide rates up about 16% over the same period over the first half of last year. Very briefly, here are the 22 cities. In all but 4 of them, homicide rates were up, and the average increase across all 22, as I mentioned, was just over 16%. We're going to be talking a bit about Chicago and about LA. LA homicides were up about 26% from the first half of last year to the first half of this year. In Chicago, homicide rates were running through June of this year about even, just a little over where they were the first half of last year. I mentioned that other crimes continue to go down. Here's a good example: home burglaries, well below prior seasonal levels. And here are the drug offenses. Drug offenses have been declining at least for the last 3 years, and you can see they're running well below their prior peaks during the pandemic period. So how do we explain the trends? I have to say we don't have definitive explanations yet, but it's pretty clear that the decline in property crimes and also drug offenses is tied to pandemic-related restrictions on population movement. When more people are at home, home burglaries go down because burglars tend to avoid occupied households. When the shops are closed, there's no shoplifting, and shoplifting is a healthy percentage of all larcenies. So in that case, in the overall decline in serious crime, which dominated by the property crimes, the story is relatively good news. A decline, a continued decline through the first half of this year. But the increases in violence, of course, are troubling. Those increases, according to our data, in most, though not all cities, the increases were quite abrupt. They began in late May and in June of last year. That is to say, immediately after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, and widespread protests emerged across the nation. And the explanations that have been given, and there are quite a few: the stress and strain of the pandemic, some have argued. Others have argued there's been a reduction in confidence and trust in the police, especially in disadvantaged minority communities. In other words, a reduction in police legitimacy. Others have argued there's been a reduction in police activity, a reduction, for example, in the proactive activities the police can engage in that can help to keep crime in check. And I want to look a little bit closer at that particular explanation. We obtained arrest and citation trend data from several cities. I'm going to talk about 3 today: Baltimore, Chicago, and Los Angeles. We're looking now at arrest trends, and in LA's case, arrest and citation trends from the first month of 2017 through June of this year. And the story is almost universal across the 3 cities and various types of arrests. For example, here are total arrest trends in Baltimore from January of 17 through June of 21. There's a downward trend both prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic, but as you can also see, there's a basic shift downward in the level of arrests in Baltimore. We see much the same thing, and in fact, it's even more glaring, that downward shift in the case of misdemeanor arrest trends in Chicago. Quite a bit higher on average prior to the pandemic than during the pandemic. Here are felony arrest trends in Chicago. Both prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic, we see there's a modest upward increase in felony arrests, but again, that quite precipitous downward shift in the level of felony arrests once the pandemic began. Here are, one might argue, well, if crimes are going down during the pandemic, wouldn't we also expect arrests to go down? True, the question is, are arrests declining at an even greater rate than crimes? And so what I was able to do in Chicago, and shown here, I just formed the ratio between arrests and offenses. These are arrests divided by offenses. And as you can see, the picture is pretty much the same. So it's not just the fact that offenses may be declining that is bringing down arrests. Arrest activity is reduced for other reasons. I think it's reasonably certain that many of those reasons are related to the pandemic. Here are misdemeanor arrest trends in LA. We see pretty much the same story. The one exception is the downward trend in felony arrests in LA from the beginning of 17 through June of this year. There's that slight increase in felony arrests that's not statistically significant. So what we're seeing there is an overall downward trend in felony arrests in LA over the last now 3.5 years. And here are citation trends in in Los Angeles from January 17 through June of this year. And as you can see, a downward trend throughout the entire period. So now we want to get some sense of whether changes in arrests are related to, and indeed may lead changes in crime. Arrests and crimes, as I've suggested, each can have an effect on the other. The more arrests, one can argue, the fewer crimes one should see. But the more crimes that occur, one would expect arrests to go up as well. So the question is, how do you untangle this two-way relationship between arrests and crimes? The answer is, it's not easy. And what I'm going to present are very provisional results that are suggestive of the kind of analyses that need to be done. The model I'm using is, I hope, it seems quite straightforward. We're going to look at crimes in any given month, and we're going to model that on the basis of the crimes that occurred in the previous month, since crime tends to follow crime. We're also going to put in the equation crimes during the previous 12 months to take account of seasonal changes in crime. We're going to put arrests in the same month that we have crimes, and arrests in the prior month, plus an overall trend indicator to capture linear trends and all of this stuff. And it's that arrests last month related to crimes this month that I'd like you to keep your eye on, because that would be suggestive of a causal impact of arrest on crime. And here are the results in summary form, the results for Baltimore. And you can see each of those indicators listed there in the left-hand column. NS means no significant effect, and we don't see a significant effect. And really what we're looking for here is this category, the lagged arrest, no significant arrest effect on either gun assault or homicide in Baltimore. A somewhat different story in Chicago. We see a negative effect of last month's arrests on this month's gun assaults in Chicago. A negative effect meaning that if arrests are going down, we would expect gun assaults to increase somewhat. Not the case for homicide, but a negative effect in the case of gun assault. We see the same thing when we're looking at misdemeanor arrests in Chicago. As they decline, we see an increase in gun assault, but no increase in homicide in Chicago. In the case of LA, we see no effect of last month's arrests on this month's gun assaults or homicide. In the case of misdemeanor arrests in LA, however, we see that negative effect both in last month's misdemeanor arrests and this month, on homicide, and the effect of last month's misdemeanor arrests on this month's gun assaults. And finally, for criminal citations, we do see an effect of last month's citations on homicide levels in LA, but not for gun assault. So it's a mixed bag of results. Let's go back to the increases we saw in violent crime. Violent crimes continue to be up in 2016 through June compared to the same period last year, but the rate of increase appears to be slowing. Other crimes continue to fall. Arrests and citations dropped during the pandemic. There's some evidence that the drop in arrests may have led to increases in violence. We see no effects in Baltimore. We did see an increase in gun assaults associated with declines in felony and misdemeanor arrests in Chicago. We saw an increase in homicides and gun assaults associated with declines in misdemeanor arrests in LA, and an increase in homicides associated with declines in criminal citations in LA. I want to make sure that I leave you with this note. These are preliminary results. The models I've used, I think, can be fairly characterized as decent, but it is very difficult to untangle that two-way causal relationship between crimes and results. And as we researchers say, more research is needed. Back to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Rick. Well, let's you presented a lot of information very quickly. And I want to just drill down on one thing and then sort of step back. The first thing is you're talking about with this newly presented information. And if you could stop sharing your screen, that'd be great.
Oh, yeah.
There we go. You're talking about, you're exploring the relationship between arrests generally and crime. I want to just ask you, do you think that all arrests should be treated equally in this area? Meaning that, if we want to reduce crime, the logic is just scale up the arrests.
That's a great question. And the answer is no, I don't think we should treat all arrests the same. If you think about both the debate that's been going on and a good bit of criminological research, there's an important idea out there, which is that police presence, police activity, especially in a community that has seen an increase in crime, can help to check that increase. That activity is often called proactive police activity, which is to say the police exercising their own discretion to increase their presence and increase their activity in areas that have seen crime increases. So I would be looking at those misdemeanor arrests and at those arrests for typically ordinance violations, the citation accounts, as better indicators of so-called proactive activity than felony arrests, okay? Ideally, we would have data on arrests that were crime specific. We'd have all the arrests for homicide, all the arrests for aggravated assaults, and so forth.
Let me just jump in for a second here. I think that's an important point to draw out, because I think that, one of the things that the sort of debate that we're having here is, there is I think, an oversimplistic debate about whether we should have more policing or less policing, and not a conversation about the right policing versus the wrong policing.
Great point.
I think there's a lot of literature that now suggests that some of the most sort of overzealous approaches to policing, mass arrests, zero tolerance approaches, A, weren't that effective in reducing crime, and B, triggered a tremendous amount of community resistance. So I just don't want your findings to be misinterpreted here.
Right. No, I think what we need to keep our eye on are proactive police behaviors. And those, mass arrest is not, is very likely unconstitutional, as was shown to be in New York. And those were mass stops, actually, that produced very few arrests. But it's a scalpel-like pinpointing of a certain kind of police activity in those areas that really need greater police protection. That's got to be done, however, in concert with, as we've written in our reports for the council, in concert with good faith efforts to implement constructive policing reforms, so that people in those communities are convinced that they're, in addition to the police attempting to save lives, they're also behaving in a just and fair manner.
Absolutely, Rick. One more quick question, and then I want to get to the rest of our panelists. You're really drilling down here on this sort of so-called depolicing effect. That's in relationship to, and it's one potential explanation of what happened during the pandemic, and particularly in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. But in other publications that you and I have written together, we've talked about other factors, such as the strain of the pandemic on individuals and institutions and other things. And so I just want to clarify, this is not the only potential explanation.
No.
Okay.
No. This is arguably, just as it was 6 years ago after the Ferguson event, and we saw homicide rates increase then, this is arguably the dominant explanation out there, that it's been a reduction of police activity that's generated the increase in violent crime. I think that explanation, frankly, has problems. We would expect property crimes also be going up if all that was at work was a reduction in police activity. No reason to think it would only affect violent crime. But the other thing to keep in mind is when that reduction occurred. We look pretty closely at when it occurred, and the reduction occurs almost immediately. And you can see that from the slides I showed, almost immediately after the pandemic began. So if we're going to talk seriously about depolicing, we have to, in my view, tie it to the impact of the pandemic on policing. There's a great deal of talk about police officers as being angered, frustrated, demoralized, and so forth. All of that may be true anecdotally and in some areas more than others. But what's really a systematic effect on policing is the pandemic itself. And that we can see simply by the sheer timing of that big drop in police activity that begins coincidentally with the beginning of the pandemic.
Thank you, Rick. Lot to unpack, lot to talk about. Jeff, I want to turn to you. You are active in this area. You've written about it. You have a dashboard tracking homicides on this issue. What does the data that you're looking at look like? Similar story, different story, and also what are the potential explanations here?
Yeah, so I'll throw this up. Hopefully everybody can see. This is the dashboard that we have on our website. Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Asher. I'm a analyst and data wonk. I have a consulting company, AH Datalytics. So we're coming off of our website here. We've built this dashboard with the idea being that this is really a service that is needed. The ability to evaluate crime trends nationally in something of a year-to-date, something of a real-time manner. If you think about baseball, you get the scores the next day. You get the scores the same day. You don't have to wait 9 months to know who won the pennant. But crime, we have to wait 9 months to understand it when a critical trend is happening in real time. So what we do here is we take year-to-date data from 75 cities and showing that right now we have murder up 13%, with murder up in 69% of the 75 cities, which is a similar approach to the same problem that Dr. Rosenfeld was talking about. We see the exact same trend. If you'd been on this dashboard 6 to 8 weeks ago, you would have seen murder up 22% in this sample of cities. So that where it's up 13% shows that it's still elevated relative to 2020, but that elevation is slowing down. And you see that in a lot of places like Chicago, where murder is below by 3, but it's still below where it was at this point last year. New York, similarly, it's above by 3 where it was at this point last year. St. Louis, which last year arguably had the largest murder rate any major American city has ever recorded, murder is down significantly because in July of last year, they had a really significant increase in murder that they didn't have this year. And if you click on the analysis of the data button, the reason that we do this analysis is that if you have enough big cities of data, and I've written on how if you have just 4 cities, New York, Chicago, Baltimore, and Los Angeles, you can actually generally predict the national trend. But if you have 50 or so cities of data, you can, this is every year since 1960, the trend of 50 biggest cities murder change versus the national change. So if
Jeff, let me just jump in here. Bottom line, do you see these trends as consistent with Rick's work? And also, what do you think is explaining them?
Yeah, absolutely. We see the same trends in our data. And I think that what explains it is the complexity of last year's murder increase, especially everything that happened last summer. We did not see the same issues of police legitimacy and depolicing that we had last summer, but a lot of the same issues that really started last year. I'm in Louisiana, so we've got the pandemic is still raging here. You've got the stresses of the pandemic. You have the depolicing / police legitimacy dual crisis that started last summer. And then you have all of the other issues that basically these issues have not solved themselves over the last 13 or 14 months. And then you throw in what we see is really historic levels of firearm carrying. I had a piece a couple of months ago looking at stops and arrests in 10 different cities and the share of those that were firearm related, either firearm or weapons related. A place like Chicago had something like a 70% decrease from January to May in terms of the number of stops that it conducted in Chicago's police department, but had a 75% or 80% increase in the number of firearms that were being found. And Jens Ludwig of the University of Chicago Crime Lab was the first one to point that out. And we see this replicated in every city, which doesn't point to that as a cause of last year's murder increase. But if you think about it as an accelerant, we have the pandemic, we have this policing crisis, and then we have way more firearm carrying than we had previously. And you get a situation where it's not, you can't just snap your fingers and take one of these causes away. Now we're talking 13, 14 months later, we're starting to see things get better. We're seeing things not as bad year to date as they were last year, but still up significantly from where we expect them to be in that sort of 2014 to period where we had this historic low in gun violence and murder.
Yeah. Jeff, I want to focus on that last part of your answer because I think it's important. There's been a lot of discussion nationally about a massive surge in legally purchased gun sales, and I think that many of us can be troubled about that for a variety of reasons. But it's not. But also, there's been some research that suggests there's not a close connection between those legal purchases and increased homicide, at least not during this narrow frame of time. I think the more interesting question is this massive surge of gun sales a symptom of an underlying phenomenon? So what you can see is when people are feeling insecure for a variety of reasons related to the pandemic and other things, there's an increase in gun sales. But what about those people at the highest risk for violence? Well, they typically can't access legal purchase. So maybe they are in response to the same thing that we're all feeling, this increased level of insecurity. they're responding by carrying weapons more frequently. And so I think it's I think we need more research in this area, but I think that drilling down on this distinction between guns generally and illegal guns possessed by those at the highest risk for gun violence is an important distinction. But let's get a little more local here and talk to our colleagues here. Deputy Chief Tingirides, tell us about what you're seeing in Los Angeles. We've talked a lot about the numbers, but what's happening behind the numbers?
We've definitely seen an increase in our homicides in Los Angeles, and something that hasn't been discussed as of yet is hate crimes. We've seen a 116% increase in hate crimes in the city of Los Angeles as well. I also think that something that hasn't been discussed yet is with a reduction in arrests and an increase in arrests for gun carrying, there isn't really a robust system in place to replace the incarceration piece. We need to have programs where folks can understand the consequences of their crime. What we're seeing is repeat arrests for individuals carrying guns and a lack of consequence for that. And so you have officers that are seeing this revolving door and not feeling like they have enough resources to address the violence in our communities because of a lack of consequence in our criminal justice system. I will say the program that I currently oversee, the Community Safety Partnership Program, we've seen a reduction in violent crime across our CSP sites by 35%. And so the question isn't the amount of policing, but the type of policing, meaningful relationship-based policing, where officers are in communities that they've built trust with, that they've had relationships with. With the increase in homicides in some of our community safety partnership sites, what also hasn't been talked about is the arrest. Because the officers have a relationship and communication, working with unarmed response, working with intervention workers that are on the ground in the community, when these homicides do occur, we're making these arrests based on those relationships and the officers' knowledge of those communities. I think it's also important to note, when we started this program, we saw a sharp decrease in arrests, in juvenile citations, and we saw a decrease in crime. So more tickets and arrests don't necessarily equate to a reduction in crime. It's meaningful policing and looking at the root cause, the systemic causes of crime in our communities, and working in partnership with our CBOs and nonprofits to address that.
I think those are such important points. I often emphasize it is not the quantity of arrests, it is the quality of arrests. And the arrests we need to be focused most on are clearing homicides and serious shootings. And there is this, we really need to move away from this old school notion, something that actually your former Chief Beck talked about, of fishing with a net and saying, well, the way to do this is just to blanket communities with mass arrests, and that's the way to deter gun activity. I think this much more targeted approach is crucial, but also not just focused on deterrence, also focused on thinking about the reasons why people might carry a gun or use a gun in the first place. This is a great transition to turn to you, Eddie, and your work. First of all, tell us a bit about what you're seeing in Chicago. Obviously, a very difficult year in Chicago in 2020, but thankfully, it seems homicides are flat year to date so far. But also, you lead a program in this area, which is really giving people something to say yes to, as opposed to just something to say no to. So, would love to hear from you.
Yeah, Thomas, and good evening, everybody. So let me start off by just taking a second or two to explain what READI Chicago really is, which stands for Rapid Employment Developing Initiative. And it was really birthed out of the number of homicides that we had in 2016. Back in 2016, we saw over 750 homicides here in Chicago. And that was the first time in 20 years that we saw this amount of shootings happening in our city. And that really caused for both government, corporations, and philanthropy, independent of each other, to think about how can they really support this issue to reduce gun violence in our city. At the end of the day, that's what gave birth to the READI Chicago model, in terms of, we know that the science, the data tells us that employment really helps to reduce gun violence. We also know that cognitive behavioral therapy, either with those who are currently incarcerated, like in Cincinnati, there's a model there, but also through youth services, that CBT has also helped to reduce gun violence. And this is according to several studies. And so the idea for us is, what does it look like to marry these two components, right? Maybe pepper it with other social services and provide more of a robust service to the people who are more likely to be drivers of gun violence. And so something that you said, Thomas, just a moment ago, that's really important for me to highlight is, at the end of the day, there's a very small population who are the drivers of gun violence. And we know this to be true across various cities. These are also the population that's more likely to be victims of gun violence. But too often, our focus, our interventions, or preventive measures typically don't go to that population, in large part because this population that I'm referring to is what I would consider called non-social service seekers, meaning they're not going to nonprofits, right, to seek for support or government. So they're, for many reasons, right, they're excluded from community and so on. But just to kind of give you a snapshot of who it is that this population really I'm referring to, 80% of the people that we work with already in Chicago are actually have unstable housing, meaning they're couch surfing. Now, this is all important in light of what happened last year with COVID, and I'll bring it back to that point. We also know that about 82% of our participants in our program, we're talking about 1,600 men, 18 years and older, have also been victims of violence. They've either been shot, stabbed, or assaulted. We also know that 1/3 of the men that we serve have been victims or survivors of gun violence. So think about that number, right? It's a pretty concentrated number of survivors of gun violence, and the impact and the ripple effects that it has not only in the community, but themselves. We also know that on average, they have 17 or 18 arrests. We know that 4 to 5 of them are felony arrests. We know that 60% of them are fathers. But we also know that 80% of our participants have only completed the 10th grade level of education, but they're really reading at the 5th grade level. So when you think about how employable are they, right? There's a long road ahead of them, right, before that actually could happen. Hence why we developed this program, to really meet people where they're at, to build, the necessary skills where they could become more, marketable, for the lack of a word, but to really create a pathway for them. And ultimately, when I talk about focus individuals who are really driving the gun violence, we're using, in relation with the partnership of the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, to really identify these individuals by using either human intel, like we have street outreach workers who identify as individuals, but we're also using the correctional systems, right? We're using the jails, Cook County Jail, we're using the Department of Corrections to identify individuals who have gun cases, who are being released either on home electronic monitoring, house arrest, or on parole. And we focus on that population because they tend to be much younger. And if you look at last year's stats, many of the individuals that were shot and killed in Chicago were not necessarily the people who were on parole doing the damage, right, doing the harm. Many of them were actually the victims, which really tells me again, are we focusing our resources in the right population? And the answer, as I think about nationally, the answer is no, Thomas, we're not. And so we have a good opportunity here to look at the various models, like what's happening in LA, what's happening in Baltimore and other places, to really think about what are the lessons that we've learned from there, and how could we use data and research to identify individuals, right, and really saturate them with resources. And the last thing that I'll say, it is because of this program that we've been able to do for the last 4 years that we're seeing 80% reduction of our participants that are, I forgot to mention, this program is being evaluated by the Crime Lab out of UFC through a randomized controlled trial study, an RCT. And so it is perhaps one of the most rigorous, studies that we could possibly do as it relates to science. But what we're seeing is 80% of those who are in the treatment group less likely arrested for murder or attempt murder. That's regardless of the clearance rate that we have in Chicago. This is really comparing apples to apples. We're also seeing a little bit over 30% of our men in Chicago less victimization as well versus the control group. So again, those are two areas that I would say, how can we unpack that? Because then we'll learn why people are carrying guns as well, and so on.
Well, wow, there was a lot in there. So let's try to unpack that. I think the first thing is you're sort of referencing a body of research that I hope that people are familiar with by now, which is that high rates of crime and violence are not spread evenly throughout the population. They're highly concentrated, not in neighborhoods, but in specific micro locations within neighborhoods. And it's also not concentrated within, violence isn't concentrated within sort of classes of people, poor people, or other classes of people. It's really within these very small networks of people. A few hundred people in a medium to large size city sort of drive this problem, and they will define failure or success in these areas. But Eddie, I think something else that you pointed out in your data is important. These individuals are highly traumatized, and they have extensive experience with the criminal justice system. So what that tells me is if it was just the criminal justice system, just arrest, just incarceration, we would have solved the problem by now. And so I think it's important, we have this all or nothing debate. It's either the police and the police have all the solutions, or we can't trust the police have no role, we need to defund them. We need to make space for this middle ground where we understand that we need both governmental solutions and non-governmental solutions. We need solutions that are focused on accountability and solutions that are focused on empathy. So, so much in what you said there. Deputy Chief Tingirides, I want to come back to you and talk about this notion of community policing. CSP is often described as a community policing program, but there's so many different models all around the country of what community policing is and isn't. It's very hard for people to understand, what's an effective community policing program and what isn't. What do you see as the difference based on your experience with CSP?
I truly believe the difference is the research that goes into this program. Prior to creating a community safety partnership site, as you mentioned, very small micro communities. The first thing we look at is that propensity for violence and that lack of relationship and trust with law enforcement. And prior to starting a CSP program, there's community sentiment surveys, there's quantitative and qualitative analysis that occurs in that community. We work with a nonprofit organization called the Urban Peace Institute, along with civil rights attorney Connie Rice. And we really look at the culture and the history of that community so that when the officers go into these communities, they understand the history, they understand the resources that are available to them. They're looking at a blueprint and uplifting that community voice who's saying, this is the type of policing we want and need in our communities. What's very impactful and powerful about uplifting that community voice as we work in these communities is having a shared responsibility. Us all sitting down at the table, maybe not necessarily agreeing with one another, but having that respect, that mutual respect, and humanizing one another to make change in our communities. Community policing, I like to call it cultural policing, relationship-based policing, getting in deep in those communities and building those relationships, identifying the strengths, creating site safety plans, looking at our crime prevention through environmental designs, what's going to make the community feel safe. Oftentimes, you can have a reduction in crime, but still have a fear and feel unsafe in your community. And how do you measure that? How do you measure the feeling of fear? How do you measure trust? That I'm beginning to trust the officers that are working in my community and we're making a change and making a difference. And I think when we look at research in quantitative and qualitative, we really have to identify that feeling of safety and that feeling of trust and how impactful that can be in a community.
Great points. Thank you, Deputy Chief Tingirides. Eddie, I want to come back to you quickly for our final question before we hear from the audience. A sort of similar question that I just asked. There are a lot of various strategies that are working to engage with these high-risk individuals and to change their lives for the better. What are, based upon your experience, what do those programs, what are some of the elements that those programs that are successful have in common?
Well, Thomas, the one that sticks out to me right away is that progress is not linear. If government, city, local, and so on is supporting a program that's a 4 to 6 or 6 month program, right? You're wasting your time, you're wasting your money. So the question is, like, for people who, as you mentioned just a moment ago too, people who've experienced a lot of trauma, it takes years to unpack that, right? People who spend time in prison, right? There's a lot of traumas associated to that. People who've seen their loved ones, go away for being incarcerated or being killed and shot, right? There's a lot that needs to be unpacked there as well. And so I would simply point out that progress is not linear, to think about 2 to 3 to 4 year kind of models as well, and to really be clear on the objectives they're trying to measure, right? Like, how do we define success? Success doesn't mean for READI Chicago that somebody comes to us and we're going to place them in a job after 18 months. Because if somebody's reading at a 5th grade level, success has to be very different. And you have to tailor your interventions based on the individual needs. That's critical. But at the end of the day, here's what I would say. One has to focus on the high level. If we're serious about reducing gun violence across the nation, as I mentioned to the president just a month ago when I was sitting with him, we have to focus on the right population, on those who are the drivers of gun violence. So after school programs, all that kind of stuff, they're important, but they're not the ones that are driving the violence. Secondly, when you look at the stats and the research, right, a little bit over 80% of the victims of shootings and perpetrators of gun violence here in Chicago are between the ages of 29, right? I mean, 18 and older, with a concentration between 18 and 29, right? So we got to think about, what does that population really look like? I would also say that leveraging the data, leveraging the evidence, what is working, right? There's so many models across the country that we could pull from. What's the data? What's the evidence telling us? How do we scale that? And how do we build capacity around that? Capacity is not just about, training more outreach workers or frontline staff. Capacity is about building the operations, right? The back office support. Last 2 things that I'll say, Tom, is center the community. As Deputy Chief just mentioned, Amanda, you got to include the community. They have to be at the center of all this. So, participant-centered approach is really critical. And the last thing that I would say, you have to promote equity. With all that we do, in light of what's taking place in our nation right now, we have to find ways to be intentional about promoting equity. And that also means, again, building the capacity of many of the nonprofits or government agencies that are entrusted to be able to do this work. Because as you mentioned earlier, Thomas, it's not about the quantity, right? It's about the quality of service that we're able to provide. And that, my friend, needs to improve. The field of gun violence is a very stagnant field, and that includes the law enforcement too. So we have to be innovative. We have to support that the very same way that Fortune 500 companies do it in their line of work.
Thank you, Eddie. Fantastic comments. I know we've got a lot of questions, so Charlotte, I'll turn to you.
Yes, thanks so much to everyone who submitted questions so far. And just as a reminder, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit a question for our panelists. We've received several questions about the distinction between different types of murder, for example, intimate partner and family violence as compared to gang violence. So I'm curious to know, what does the data say about these differences? And also folks would like to know, is there one type driving the majority of the violence we're seeing in our communities? And maybe do we have any additional information related to motive, victim offender relationship that could help us elucidate the reasons behind these increases?
Rick, I'm going to turn very quickly to you on that, if you could give us a quick answer.
Sure. Well, no, generally speaking, we don't, for a large number of cities, have data that would enable us to distinguish between one type and another type of homicide. Keep in mind that these are data on homicide victims. And in a large fraction of homicides, we know nothing about the offender, and therefore we often know very little about the circumstance of the homicide. With respect to domestic violence generally, not simply homicide, there has been research, our own research done for CCJ has shown no real change in domestic violence during the pandemic. But CCJ has also sponsored a study focusing on the first few months of the pandemic that did show a modest increase in domestic violence of about 8%. So I would say with respect to domestic violence, the data are somewhat mixed. Keep in mind too that we're relying on police data. A victim has to report the violence to the police. And if victims are being sequestered with their abusers or potential abusers, that can, of course, affect their ability to report those crimes. So there's some uncertainty about domestic violence.
I would also just say there are limitations, but I would say anecdotally, everything that we're seeing is that the primary drivers of the homicide rates that we're seeing today are the same drivers that we're seeing in previous times. And that means that these rates are largely driven by the phenomenon of community gun violence. It's usually between and among young men without a lot of opportunities or much hope.
Correct.
Charlotte?
Yeah, so we have a question from Aaron Jemison, who noted that both Eddie and Deputy Chief Tingirides referenced both juveniles and young people in their communities. Can folks on the panel say more about whether these trends that we're discussing today extend to juvenile offending over the past year, and what we know about whether there's a connection there?
Eddie, why don't we turn to you for that one?
Yeah, so one of the things that I know for sure is that we've seen an increase of carjacking with young people here in the Chicagoland area. And so that is so this goes back to, like, you know, the issues around how do you help young people. We're talking about young people under the age of 17, just to be clear, right? But what we're also seeing is an increase of guns. When Jeff mentioned and Professor Richard mentioned about gun offenses and so on, we know that last year about 11,000 guns were taken out of the street of Chicago, right? And most of those guns were by young people. And I'm saying 18 to about 26-year-old, right? So the early emerging adults. And that's really critical because what we're also seeing right now is, you know, we're seeing an influx of young people being released from prisons as well. And those are also, in large part, some of the ones we've seen last year be victims of gun violence. So I'll have to simply say, when I think about who we're focusing on based on the data that we have, they tend to be more between the ages of like 19 to 26 in Greater Chicago. About 83% really fall in that category because of the previous arrest and the type of arrest they actually have.
I think that's an important point. I think many people believe that youth violence sort of drives the broader community gun violence issue, but that's really not the case. It tends to be younger adults and even adults now trending into their 30s.
Right.
Charlotte?
Yes, thank you for that answer, Eddie. And we only have about 3 minutes left. So here's a question perhaps for all of our panelists that we've...
Charlotte, let me just call an audible. And for those who want to stay on, let's do an additional 5 minutes, just so we can get to a couple more questions. So let's end at 1:05.
Yeah, here's a question that we received via email from an audience member, perhaps for all of our panelists, who asked, what has most surprised each of you about the crime trends that we're seeing this summer? And in your opinion, where do we think the field needs to focus its efforts?
Great question. Jeff, let's begin with you.
I mean, I guess what surprised me is that it's doing what I had hoped it would, which is that we knew that once we sort of hit the summer and we passed the point where we saw the peaks last year, that hopefully we would see this elevated but deceleration. And it's, I mean, you know, nothing in studying murder is pleasant, but this is as pleasant a surprise as possible in that it's hopefully a sign that we're not still rising. And then obviously, you know, I'll steal the answer that I think everybody would give, which is that better data in this field is desperately needed. More real-time data, more data in with better clarity and not just big picture stuff, but the little picture stuff as well.
Okay, this is a lightning round question. So Emada, your thoughts. What's most surprising?
I think most surprising is how quickly the crime began to increase in such a short amount of time, packed in with a pandemic. And what really isn't discussed a lot too is the economics and the decrease in jobs and the impact that that had on communities. But I think most surprising to me is a level of violence centered around conflict. A lot of the violence that we're seeing in Los Angeles is relationship-based, narcotic-based, disputes, neighbor disputes, and that goes back to people living in communities with post-traumatic stress and not having the mental tools to address that conflict, and feeling like the only way to address it is to get a gun or a knife to resolve that conflict. And I think that that's most surprising to me.
Rick, what was most surprising to you?
Yeah, well, I was surprised, but should not have been, by the abruptness of the increase in homicide and gun assaults in late May and June of last year. I was taken aback by how abrupt that was, following upon the murder of George Floyd and protest activity across the country. Should not have been surprised, nor should, I would argue, any of our panelists been surprised, because we saw the very same phenomenon 6 years ago after Ferguson and comparable events across the country. We saw a big homicide increase then that was widespread across big cities. It was not as large as the increase we saw last summer. We didn't have a pandemic 6 years ago, I should say. But we should not be surprised yet again if we see a big uptick that follows a illegitimate police use of force incident that goes viral.
Thank you, Rick. Eddie, what surprised you?
Two quick things. One is I was surprised by the kind of caliber of weapons they're using right now.
Yes.
We're seeing higher caliber weapons and even more bold in the kind of shootings that are involved, right? So like this is in front of Cook County Jail, in front of police officers sometimes. So I'm a little surprised on that. And then secondly, surprised and not surprised is the lack of government's willingness to plan 3, 4, 5 years ahead, right? The lack of just vision, right, and political will to think, to not be reacting only, right, but to also think about how do you plan ahead, right, in the future. And that's again surprising and not surprising.
Thank you.
Much for that. Yeah, Eddie, I want to build off of what you just made a point to say, which is that we're really at an important moment with a supportive administration and a lot of unity and determination to seriously address violence. But in your mind, and perhaps other panelists' minds, what's most important for everyone to keep in mind so that all this energy and momentum isn't squandered?
Well, quick response to that, Charlotte, is like, one, I'm extremely hopeful by our current administration in DC in the way they're talking and trying to put resources behind the gun violence, right, while keeping an eye on the issue around criminal justice reform. So it gives me hope. It gives many of the people that I work with and the communities that I serve a lot of hope. But hope is not enough, right? So at the end of the day, our expectations, right, is that we could truly leverage these resources, right, to really disrupt the way that we've been going about our work. So I'm talking about disrupt the police departments, right, the way they're going about the work, disrupt the way government's been operating, right? And again, even nonprofits in the local level. I keep going to this comment about equity. This is the time to build the equity that is really needed. So when there's ever another pandemic, hopefully that wouldn't be the case, we are in a better position, right, to support those who are in higher need.
Deputy Chief Tingirides, let's have your answer and that'll be the final word.
I agree with you, Eduardo, 100%. I too am hopeful, and quality through continuous improvement. Having entities like law enforcement, nonprofit organizations, CBOs self-evaluate. And then I think something else that's so key is to remember our victims and remember the impact that this violence has had on the families of our victims, and uplifting their voice at times, because often they get forgotten about, and everybody's so focused on the trigger puller rather than the impact that violence has in the families.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. And thank you to all of our panelists for an exciting conversation. I think, as you can see, there's just too much to cover in an hour. And so I would just ask all of the audience, as this violent crime working group rolls out concrete guidance on policies and practices, engages in more webinars and briefings, stay with us, stay tuned. This is an important conversation and there's a lot to cover.
Yes, totally agree. Thanks so much, Thomas. And thanks so much to you all for joining us today. Please head to our website, counciloncj.org, to follow along with both the council's work and the work of the Violent Crime Working Group. And for more day-to-day updates, we encourage you to follow us on Twitter at counciloncj. Thanks so much, everyone. See you next time.